You're listening to Win-Win, an entrepreneurial community with your host, Ben Wolf.
And welcome to Win-Win, an entrepreneurial community. As always, I'm your host, Ben Wolf. Happy to have you here today. And we are going to learn from our guest today, what is a fractional chief operating officer? So looking forward to that. And I'll remind everyone who is watching or listening now to subscribe wherever you're listening to or watching this, whether that's YouTube. And if it's YouTube, make sure to click on that, always remind me button on the bell so that you always get the notifications. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you're listening to this. Please make sure to leave a review. It definitely would help get this out there to more people, and it would help me out. Make sure to keep getting the message out because a lot more people are listening to the show recently, and would like to keep up that trend and get the value that we're sharing here out to more people. And with that, I want to get on to introducing our guest today, who is an outsourced chief operating officer or fractional chief operating officer at several companies through his company, Verdant Partners, in the Detroit, Michigan area and anywhere for his remote clients. He previously has spent many years as a general manager and president at several organizations. He was a senior consultant at PwC and Arthur Andersen. For those who remember Arthur Andersen. And you can find out more about him at kentrupke.com. That's Ken Trupke, Trupke.com. And with that, I give you Ken Trupke. Welcome, Ken.
Hey, good morning, Ben. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure, and happy that you could make it on today. And so I want to start off with asking you if you could please give me and our watchers and listeners a quick, 2-minute background on, kind of so people have some context for what you're doing now, where that came from, how you got here, and just so we have a little context to understand you and the stuff you're sharing a little bit better.
Sure. Thanks. So I grew up in Milwaukee and worked for, as you said, Arthur Andersen and Price Waterhouse, things that used to be things, as a consultant, never as an accountant, and not that smart, but it was the dawn of kind of business process reengineering and what's kind of transformed into lean now. And so I got to see a lot of different companies, and we were implementing inventory systems and updating accounting systems. It's kind of the time of people moving off mainframes and other systems to PCs. And so I got to see a lot of companies, and I started to realize that I was really curious about how things are made, that process, regardless of the business, regardless of the industry, just how things get done really interested me. And so one of the partners left Arthur Andersen, as people do, move up or out, and bought a company in Michigan, an injection molding company, and brought me over to do that same kind of consulting, that lean manufacturing process improvement stuff. And I started to realize that it takes people to get things done. And so I started getting really interested in leadership, and it's not the systems and the technology that's necessary, but not sufficient. And you really got to get people to move these things along. And so I started to aspire to getting a little bit more span of authority than beyond just the system stuff. And so ended up being general manager for a stretch, and then ultimately president at that company. So what was supposed to be a 2-year engagement turned into 14. We ended up selling it. I stayed on in transition for a couple of years, and then popped up and realized that I didn't really know anyone in Michigan because I'd been heads down. I knew my customers, I knew my suppliers, I knew my team, but I hadn't really spent time anywhere else. And so just started really investing in networking and making connections, and that led to what.
And why were you doing that? Were you still at the company then?
No, I had left.
Okay.
In after the transition to the new ownership, spent 2 years in transition with them, and then decided it was time to move on to the next thing. It had been 14 years, so I figured my two-year sentence was up at that point. And it actually had.
Sounds like Jean Valjean.
Yeah. So then that led to a series of what became kind of fractional COO, CEO, but just interim executive positions.
Right.
And that's taken me to where I am now.
Right. That's really interesting. And obviously, I'm hoping that we can get a lot more focused and dive down a lot deeper into those kind of people things that really caught your interest and, what you realized was even more key than some of the technical process stuff that you had started off with. But before I do that, I want to just get a picture painted so people can see themselves. the kinds of places that are bringing you in. Like, why are they bringing you in as a fractional chief operating officer, COO, part-time COO, interim COO, whatever they call it? Why are they bringing you in? What is the pains that they're having? What are their problems? What are their scenarios? So that people can maybe see themselves and, like, where does this fit in? When is this a solution?
Sure, great question. So typically for an interim or a fractional thing, it's because they're not big enough to afford it. So in a lot of the businesses that I've worked with, the owner is the founder, and he started it, and now it's gotten to a point that his span of control is too broad, and the business is really limited by his ability to touch everything. And he hasn't maybe brought on that second in command or that good operating person. And typically those owner, operator, founder types, they're visionaries. She had an idea and took it and ran with it and really enjoys the customer interaction, but not so much the day-to-day operations. And now it's gotten big enough that you really need somebody in there. And so I've worked with companies that the founder, as somebody else bought them, sold an interest, and now is a minority partner, and it's just not the right fit anymore. And now the majority owner, maybe a private equity company or family office, just doesn't see them as a fit for where they want to take the company. And so they'll bring me in as an interim person. I've done that. Sometimes there's no succession plan. They just didn't kind of see this coming. They've grown and grown, and now they said, hey, we're big enough, but we don't have anybody. We need to find somebody to come in. And then
meaning that the owner wants to retire or sell?
No,
or what do you mean
wants
succession
the owner
plan?
wants to continue to grow it more, but not have to be in on the day-to-day. And so succession to somebody who can take over that operations part, because the owner's typically, she's operating as well as selling and being the face of the business.
Right.
So now they can't do both. So they got to really divide their time, and their interest and talent set lies in that outside facing role, and they need somebody on that inside facing role. And so they'll bring me in to put those systems and structures in place. And then maybe there's somebody on the team that you can groom into that spot, or maybe they need to find somebody full time once that's built. There's as you know, there's a difference between building and operating. And so to come in and help them build a system and structure for a COO or general manager to be successful, we can do that. Once that's set, then they can bring somebody in. But to bring somebody in to kind of chaos and expect them to build it and then run it, that's a tall order. So
not always the same person that's right for both, you mean?
Absolutely. So, and then sometimes there's just somebody that just left. So they had somebody and they left, and they need somebody in here to just hold down the fort while they do their search and find somebody. So those are kind of the typical reasons, but maybe the more interesting ones are some other kind of projects I've been on, and those fall into a couple categories. And one is somebody's unhappy. They're just unfulfilled. Again, that owner, founder, she started the business with this vision of freedom and lifestyle and interacting with customers and building and growing and selling and doing all the things that she really enjoys. And now she's bogged down with people things. And it's just gotten bigger than she wants to deal with on a day-to-day basis. They started it because they loved it, and now there's all these problems.
Right.
And so, think of like a Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg, or Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer. A lot of times in big companies, there's that visionary starter. Not that Bill Gates didn't program, but he had Ballmer to block and tackle and run the operations once it got to scale. Right. And so it's very common to have that visionary versus integrator kind of duality. And so it gets to a point that they just can't
and you're using that EOS terminology. I know you're familiar with EOS.
Sure, yeah, and that's great. Yeah, and if people are familiar with that's really good language to help clarify what we're talking about. That the founder's typically the visionary, and what they really need is that integrator. So the unhappy, unfulfilled is a reason to bring somebody in, and they just realize that this isn't working. Another one where I brought in a number of times is poor performance. So it might be steady drop in performance. I had a client that just neglected their business for over 10 years. It was a father-son team. The father had started it in the 70s, his manufacturing company here in Michigan, and they had done really, really well. The 80s and 90s were great times, high times in U.S. manufacturing. Right. The supply chain was all here. We were all here. It was great. The phone rang. Well, they kept thinking the phone was going to continue to ring into the 2000s. And as you know, the internet, China, and Mexico really changed all that. Yeah. So they just hadn't reinvested in the people or the equipment or training or really anything. They're just kind of living on their past. And the business was slowly declining. And so that was a wake-up call to come in and say, hey, this isn't going like that. They're looking to transition from the father to the son, and the son's looking around and say, I've only seen you when it was the high season, and now that things are, I don't know how to do this differently. So
what did you do? What did you do there when you came in?
We came in and really worked on first the immediate problems. They needed sales, and they needed to rethink investment. They needed to think about, what do we got to do to turn this equipment over, and what investment do we want to make in upgrading our equipment and our processes. In this situation, the process that they had made their living on had really left them behind. The industry had evolved beyond them, and the way they were making the product wasn't kind of the current way of making product. And so they needed to decide, are we going to continue to play in this kind of old place and pick up the work that's still like that, or do we want to start moving into the newer things that required some investment? People, they had a lot of people that had been there a long time. People would say, I've been here 15 years. And I'm like, well, you really, I wouldn't say this to their face, but really they'd been there 1 year 15 times, because they just hadn't evolved. They hadn't learned, they hadn't grown. And that's not on them. That's on the company for not investing in them and training them and developing them. But it was the same equipment, doing the same process, the same way for 15 years. So yeah. So we really needed to get our head around, where do we want to go? And that started to lead into some core purpose, Jim Collins kind of stuff, core purpose and core values. What are we really trying to do here? And that was time spent with the son, because it was going to be his company.
Ultimately.
And then what does that mean in terms of investment in people and equipment and facilities? And who do we want as customers? Just all that kind of stuff. So that's kind of a steady decline story. I also had a client that had a sudden decline. It was about a $12 million manufacturer. And within the span of 4 weeks, they lost $4 million of sales. They had two $2 million projects that got pulled. Totally unrelated, different stories in each scenario. But within 4 weeks, they went from 12 to 8. And the problem was that the 8 that they kept was not great. It turned out that the 4 was really profitable work, and it was covering a lot of sins. And so not only had their sales dropped, and so they've got this fixed cost coverage issue, but on a variable basis, it wasn't good either. And so that's something that's, a wake-up call to say, hey, we gotta think quickly about doing things differently. And so in that case, it was really about triage and where can we cut. You're not going to save your way to profitability, but you can definitely throw some ballast off in the interim. And so that's what we worked on doing, and then just tried to right the ship. Cash flow statements were an important piece of that one early on. We just make sure we've got money and we know where it is. They hadn't really paid attention to that because they were kind of doing well. So that drop could be sudden. So it could be a steady drop. It could be a sudden drop.
A lot of people know those sudden drops recently.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. COVID's a really good example of where the unexpected happens and suddenly your sales fall off. And now you got to figure out, well, what are we going to do? Can we pivot? Can we triage and live in the interim? It would just make sense to shut this thing down. I had a very hard conversation with these guys when I first got there about when because they'd lost such a chunk of their business. And this was 4 or 5 years ago. This wasn't an '08 issue, and this wasn't a COVID issue. It was just something happened in between there. But we talked about shutting it down. I said, you could just wind this thing down right now. If you're ever going to do that, this is the time. And again, and so they just didn't want to do that. They had a lot of pride. It was a classic community town where they were the industry in that community, and they were the employer that everybody worked at. Everybody knew them. And so
a lot bigger than just a business.
Yeah, so they were really reluctant to step down and wind it down. They really want to say, hey, we're part of this community. We owe it to the community ourselves. There's a pride factor there that's justifiable. And they wanted to figure it out. And the good news was they had the money. So it was not only willing, but they were able. If one of those two was missing, if they either didn't want to or they just couldn't afford it, well, then you got to do something different. But they were willing and able, and to their credit, they made the investment and we got it back up.
I mean, and like bringing somebody like you in or a fractional COO, one of these type of things is like you have that manufacturing background. I mean, like these examples, and so not only do you have the industry experience, like you've been there, you've seen these things, you've redone operations, I don't know, a bunch of times. And so, I mean, the problem you're solving also is just that, like you said, they'll maybe be running in the hamster wheel, and also they just haven't done this before,
Yeah.
They just don't know, or the son's doing
Yeah.
it. They just never saw it any other way. They just don't know. So you just
Yeah.
bring in somebody at a lower price point than like hiring somebody full time. And like you point out, the one who's going to run it, not necessarily the one that's going to, be doing it temporarily. So
Yeah.
it's another right person, right seat type of thing to maybe say, okay, we need someone on a interim basis for a few quarters or a year or two, build things up, fix things up, and then hand it off to somebody full time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you've been there
Absolutely.
and you've done that. So
Yeah.
it's just the value of somebody like that, I guess, is
Yeah.
what I'm seeing.
Yeah, in those initial meetings, I make sure that I'm clear that, listen, there's no shame. In fact, the opposite. There's credit. To your credit, you recognize the situation and sought someone like me to come in and help you. Raising your hand to get help is something to be proud of, not to be embarrassed by. But that can be tough because again, these the owner founder types have a lot of pride in what they've built and a lot of emotional attachment to it. And they want to figure it out because they've always figured it out. And for her to raise her hand and say, hey, I might need some help here.
But nobody's good at everything. Nobody's good at everything.
Absolutely.
So yeah, it's absolutely not something to be embarrassed about. But of course it is natural, like you say, to feel that way.
And as you pointed out, it can be it can be just something they haven't done before. And there's no shame in that. Like, you didn't see this. I see this all the time. So yeah, how would you know how to do this? So,
right.
So that poor performance is one. And then the last one is just sometimes, and I've been brought in a couple of times on these, there's friction. There's friction between this couple situations I've been involved. Well, one was a family, his father and a couple sons, and they couldn't get along and they couldn't figure it out. And they tried to operate the business, but they kept stepping on each other's toes.
Right.
And they just needed somebody to come in and kind of referee, but also to structure it and more objectively and say, hey, here's an org chart with responsibilities, and you're going to be in this lane and you're in this lane, and we'll meet to make sure we're communicating, but this is how we're going to divide and conquer. And in another case, it was just several partners and unrelated, not family,
people,
but
right.
a series of partners. And same thing, they were stepping on each other's toes and didn't have a common vision and didn't know what to do with it. This was in a professional services business, the family one, and in a software business in the other. So again, it doesn't matter the industry; these are common problems across the business.
Right.
So the unhappy, unfulfilled, the poor performance, whether sudden or gradual, and then that friction can be other reasons besides you just have a gap in your business or outgrew it.
Right. And when you get into that kind of friction, that kind of gets back to what I hinted at earlier that I hope you'll dive into a little bit more, is tell me more about what you've seen as like these kind of people issues that almost trump those process issues so often in so many of the instances that I know you get into. Like, what are the people issues that people are facing, and how do you help them get to the other side of it? I mean, you said a little bit about it just now, like the org chart and things, but like, how do you handle that, and what's the issue?
Yeah, great question again. Thanks. So what I've found is that people don't struggle with what I'll call the technical answer. When the machine's broken, somebody knows how to fix that machine, or the line's down in manufacturing, or how to deliver the service. If you're a consulting firm, like, how to do your business. Those aren't the issues. That 60 to 70% that makes your business unique is typically not where I see people struggle. It's that 30 to 40%, that's the people thing that everybody has in common. Everybody's got employees, everybody's got customers and suppliers, everybody faces accountants and lawyers and bankers that they need to deal with. So there's always people involved, and it's in that 30 to 40% that's not unique is where I see the trouble, because it's just, we know how to do the business part, it's the people part. And people don't come to work thinking they're going to screw things up. It's not like, if by noon I don't mess up 3 at least, pretty significant things, today's going to be a washout. Everybody's trying to do their best, but when you don't make it clear what good looks like, what Ken Blanchard talks about, like, what does winning look like? You got to make that clear. And then if you've got the right people, they're happy to run at that target. But when you don't make that clear, they're going to do their best with what they think you want. Right. And the bad news is people aren't mind readers. And as much as a lot of business founders that I've met expected and were disappointed
they get upset at people for not just not having the same exact assumptions that they have.
Yeah. It was in my head. I don't know why you didn't know what to do. So just be clear about what you're doing and why. kids are great at this. Why? And we don't really outgrow that. It's not because we're always kids, but we're always people. And kids are people too. And we just have that need to say, I want this in context. So help me understand. And the beauty of that is that if you just tell them what to do, well, then if something changes in that plan, they're not going to know what to do. And then they're coming back to you all the time. They're taking a step and checking it, taking a step and checking. If you say what we're trying to accomplish and why, well, now they can go a little bit further because they've got the context. They're like, we're trying to achieve this.
Right, exactly.
So this didn't work, but I know what we're trying to do. So it's like a detour. If you're driving somewhere and you hit a detour, you don't say, I'll go home, or you don't call somebody and go, hey, I'm at the detour. What should I do now? You go, okay, well, I still know where I'm going. I just need to go a different way. So, and only people can think. Machines are great. I'm a huge fan of automation. If you can get a repeatable task, whether that's a process for payroll, like a people kind of process that you can automate with software, or in manufacturing, if you get a machine or a robot, like that's not what people were made to do. People weren't made to do this all day.
Repetitive, yeah.
Yeah, and it's kind of dehumanizing when
Mindless.
people need to do that. So what people are really good at is solving problems and thinking, but you got to let them enter into the problem. You got to share with them what you're trying to do. And so I've just seen that that's how you get traction. When you let people understand what we're trying to accomplish, give them those goals, and then kind of step back. I like to say, tell people what, but not the how. I think that goes back to Patton. He was a big fan of tell the Army the objective and then get out of the way and let them accomplish it. I found that works really well. Now you got to have the right people. You got to have them trained. There's a lot.
That's a huge. That's right. It's a huge precursor requirement.
Yeah. But conceptually, that's what makes sense. And when you put the people over, ahead of the process and say we're going to work on people, they'll, in some cases surprise you. I think gotten past being surprised by that. I just know that we're going to unleash a lot of power by pulling everyone in, because that's what people really want. People want to feel like they're working for something that's valuable and be part of something meaningful and have decisions to make, to be human and use their humanity and their brain rather than just their hand doing this all day. And so if you can make clear what we're trying to do, people will join in.
Right.
Now, frankly, you're going to find that some people aren't. Some people are really comfortable doing this all day and being there 1 year, 15 times. They self-select. As you truly move into this place where we're going to really focus on people and empower them, it's kind of an overused word, but in the right context, it's true. And we're going to really move in that direction. The people that don't really want to have to think and be part of things and kind of put themselves on the line and be accountable, they leave. They say, this isn't for me anymore. And when I come in on projects, especially if it's kind of a turnaround type project or there's some crisis that we got to, there's an urgency, I'll make clear in kind of a town hall meeting that, hey, listen, this isn't going to be for everybody. I'm telling you, we're going to be moving, and we're going to be moving faster than you're probably used to. And we hope everybody comes along, but we know that that's just not going to happen.
Right. So, you're talking a lot about communication, I noticed.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. The three words I like to use a lot are communication, alignment, and engagement. We got to get people aligned on the task. Let's be clear about what we're trying to do with people, and then help them to engage in that and really give them autonomy. And it's all wrapped up with communication. You just got to repeat yourself over and over. Dave Ramsey says, if your people can't do a serviceable impression of you, you haven't repeated yourself enough. So,
that's interesting. I never heard that. They have, there's a really cool thing that, they're having with Dave Ramsey's having this big thing in Nashville, like in May or April or something, with like Jim Collins and Patrick Lencioni and I don't know, like every single big name. I don't know, whatever. I forgot all of them, but like every single big name out there is like speaking at this thing. It happens to be over a Jewish holiday, so I can't make it. But
okay.
And I'm from Nashville originally, so
nice.
That would have been a great excuse to see my parents. But
okay.
I'm curious about drama.
Yeah.
Drama that gets in people's. What does drama look like in organizations? How do you deal with it?
Yeah. Again, great question. So. Really two parts to that is what I found to be successful. The first is, it's another Dave Ramsey, is implementing a no gossip policy. And gossip is defined as talking about something negative to someone who can't fix it. So if you're talking to the person you're having the problem with, that's not gossip. If you're talking to your boss about a situation, that's not gossip. But talking
I love that definition. I tell people the same thing. It's like toxic. You're talking about something about something with people that can't do anything about it or can't help you,
Yeah.
then, if you're talking to it about somebody above you, I tell people, like the visionary, I tell them, if you're talking to me, like as the integrator, the COO, or you're talking to the CEO, I'm talking about the leadership level,
Right.
then great. You're just talking to each other and it's just kvetching and complaining. Like
Yes. Yeah. And it's poison. It really is.
Yeah,
And
totally.
some organizations have learned to thrive on that because it's really a function of powerlessness, and that cuts both ways, because on the one hand, the organization isn't communicating goals and making winning clear what that looks like. On the other hand, you got people who kind of thrive in that victim, like, oh, we'd be doing this, but they won't let us.
Yeah.
I have what I call the pronoun test, that you're not allowed to say they, and I'll stop you. And I'll stop you in a meeting in front of people.
Oh, yeah?
Who's they? Because they don't work here. Only we work here.
Right.
We're like, well, I mean, like the sales team. Well, then say the sales team. Or well, I meant Bob.
Right.
Well, then say Bob.
Everybody, or they'll say, like, a lot of people think. You ever hear that one?
Oh, sure.
A lot of people think.
Yeah.
Well, who's a lot of people?
Right.
It's like you and one other person you spoke with.
Yeah. So if I get this, like, they won't let us, and we're trying to, and we're trying to do things, but they're stopping us, and, we're helping, but they're hurting. Like, there's a lot of victim there. And so to move past this, to get out of that drama situation, you got to be clear. So give people what winning looks like, so that they can't say, I didn't know.
Right.
And then on the other hand, you got to hope that the victims self-select, or else have really clear conversations with them. Like, look, this doesn't work. You've got to start taking responsibility.
What do you mean? Like meaning, wait, you talk about making outcomes clear, making job descriptions and outcomes clear, and then making clear this kind of no gossip policy with that definition. And then when you talk about that, again, you talk about self-selecting, but if people continue to engage in that behavior and poison the environment, create a toxic environment, then you're just saying that ultimately that becomes a point at which you're giving people like warnings, and that becomes a termination process at some point.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. And I've got a real low tolerance for all that. And you just need, what I found is that you only need one example. As soon as somebody gets fired for gossiping and you make it clear that that's what happened, it just shuts it down. People are like, oh, wow, this is for real.
And
it's unfortunate.
This is not tolerated.
Yeah, absolutely. So the no gossip is a big piece. The other thing is what I learned from the dog whisperer, what I call it, get the dogs walking. Cesar Millan teaches that if you want dogs to get along, when they're walking, that's their work, and they're super focused. And I've actually done this with dogs when we've dog sat for friends or whatever. And they're like, well, I don't know, our dog doesn't get along with that. I'm like, don't worry about it. It'll be fine. And what I do is that first time they get together, let them sniff a little bit, and then we start walking. And within a few steps, they're doing their thing. They're just moving along because they're walking.
We have two dogs, and one of them is new. So
and so
that's interesting. You mentioned
when they're walking, they're working. And so in the workplace, again, not to demean people like we're dogs, but just apply this concept of when you give people work, when you give them something to do that they can focus on, they kind of don't have time for all the drama. They don't have time to be complaining and gossiping, and they got stuff to do. So part of the reason. So
big goals, big things they could be accomplishing side by side, and they're focusing on the task at hand more so, less time for the drama.
Yeah, because again, people come to work. You got to believe that people come to work to do their best and are trying to win and help and be productive. And when they don't have those things to do, well, then they're going to look for an outlet, and that outlet is often gossip. So part of the solution to that isn't just go, no gossip, I'm going to fire people who well, you can also give them something to do so they don't have time to gossip and they're not interested in gossiping. Because I want to come to work to be productive. So if you give me something I can do, I'd much rather do that than be over here in the coffee room complaining. So be clear about what the goals are, and set some things out there as tasks and milestones. Get some metrics in place so we can measure and see that we're making progress. And then again, just repeat. No gossip, and here's what we're doing.
Right. No, that's great stuff. I mean, in terms of the type of stuff that especially you as an outsider, or bringing in a COO like yourself, a fractional integrator like me, bringing in these people from the outside, they could see that stuff. They could maybe be a little bit more objective and not kind of so in the context that they can't really see what's going on. Yeah, can come in and help people get beyond the drama with some of that. Focusing on outcomes, focusing on staying busy with a shared task, working side by side. Obviously, having a no tolerance policy for gossip, talking about things with people who can't help it. Right. And then you talk about that process stuff and that problem solving stuff, about just having someone on board who's been there and done that, but not having to go to this huge investment and process of having to find somebody full time.
Right.
And then you could find that person while you have this fractional COO or fractional leader.
Yeah,
so,
and I'll help you do that because I don't want to be here forever either. I want to move.
So I do with my clients. I interviewed my full-time integrator replacements.
Right.
That's what I consider a successful engagement.
Yeah.
Is get them to the point where they've scaled big enough. I mean, sometimes sometimes it's an issue of you just lost somebody and you're coming in to fill a seat that was suddenly vacant. But sometimes, like you said, it's where they're not big enough or they can't afford somebody full-time anyway.
Yeah.
So get them to where they could scale big enough and then help them find your full-time replacement or get them turned around or whatever it is through a period of time and then find that full-time replacement. So, I mean, it's a huge value, and that's why I wanted to bring you on. So I really appreciate all that stuff that you're able to share today.
Sure. Oh, you're welcome. Yeah, definitely my pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I appreciate that. Hopefully people can, I know people will learn a lot from this. Maybe obviously they could reach out to you, kentrupke.com. I got that right. Yeah, kentrupke.com, Trupke, kentrupke.com. Or find someone like you, like me, like, doing the kind of stuff that we do. Yeah. I think it's a great resource. And if it's a right fit for people, I know that they will have learned a lot from that, from listening to you today, Ken. So thank you so much. Appreciate you coming out.
Yeah, you're welcome, Ben.
My pleasure. And we'll see everybody else on the other side. Thank you.
You're listening to Win-Win, an entrepreneurial community with your host, Ben Wolf.